We're talking with John Fleck, author of Water is for Fighting Over, very high on the Amazon.com ranking. I think it's up around number 3 or 4 in its category. John, thanks for joining me in this podcast.
It's great to be visiting Arizona again, if only by telephone today.
Thanks for doing that, John. Listen, about the book, it was an excellent read, very human scale, and dealt with a very complex subject, water in the Southwest, in a very readable way. The ultimate message of Water is for Fighting Over, and I guess I should note the rest of the title and other myths about water in the West. The ultimate message of Water is for Fighting Over is hopeful. As you acknowledge in your book, that is a rare perspective. Can you tell us what made you a believer?
I have been writing about water as a journalist, as a newspaper journalist in Southern California. I started in the 1980s and for 25 years in Albuquerque, and then sort of shifted over to an academic life where I'm at the University of New Mexico now with the university's Water Resources program. And I grew up in a narrative of trouble, a narrative of doom, the narrative of Cadillac Desert, which, Mark Reisner's great book, published in 1986, when I first started writing about this, argued that we had made these big mistakes in building these dams and artificial rivers in great cities, Albuquerque and Phoenix and Denver and Los Angeles, in a desert where they perhaps didn't belong, and these great farming districts, Imperial and the vast farmlands of Maricopa County. And it was a narrative that suggested that we were headed for a crash. And that was the narrative I grew up in, and that was the thing that I most often wrote about for many, many years about water, looking at declining supplies, looking at dwindling groundwater, looking at shrinking reservoirs, and expecting a crash. And what I came to realize, and this was, within the last 10 years or so, working as a water beat reporter for the Albuquerque Journal here in New Mexico, I would go, a small town would run out of water, and we would swoop down with our cameras and document the trouble. But I began to realize that we were all swooping down on the same 1 or 2 or 3 towns, and that if you looked around New Mexico as a whole, in fact, most communities weren't running out of water, and that sort of the implicit prediction of these great narratives that we were doomed was not playing out. And I became increasingly interested in the stories of what people were doing who weren't running out of water. How did they do that? They were adapting. They were using less water. They were learning to share water with their neighbors. And I became increasingly fascinated with the story of where that adaptive capacity comes from and how it works, because it's an incredibly important story going forward, because it contains lessons that we will need, because times are only going to get more difficult here in the West.
Well, that is a theme that seems to run pretty consistently through your book, and that is the idea of collaboration and adaptation. And one story in particular was one of the early ones that you told, and I thought it was a fascinating human scale story, and that was the meeting on the Colorado River raft trip between Sid Wilson, who at the time was the general manager of Central Arizona Project, and environmentalist Jennifer Pitt. That was a great story, because those two people at the time were pretty much at loggerheads over issues regarding water in the Southwest, weren't they?
It was a sort of remarkable turning point, but a quiet one. So Sid and Jennifer, who I talked to at length for the book, really didn't get along, really disagreed strongly about the role of water for the environment and the needs of water for the cities. And the folks on the environmental side thought the cities were just trying to take too much, and the folks on the municipal side thought the environmentalists were just trying to take away water that was properly should go to the cities. And they spent some days on the river. This was a organized attempt to accomplish this. Bennett Rayleigh, who at the time was the Assistant Secretary of the Interior, organized this trip to try to get the warring parties together. They got to know one another. They became friends. A collaborative process grew out of that over time developed some really innovative solutions for water sharing that allowed water to stay in a really important wetland down in Mexico, the Cienega de Santa Clara, that allowed the Central Arizona Project to make some steps toward meeting its needs. And so rather than litigating and fighting and being at loggerheads, these two sides realized that by better understanding the needs of the other, they could find some space in the middle, some common ground. And, it's a single example, but an important case study for the kind of thing that once I started looking for it, I found over and over and over again around the basin, where people get together, learn one another's needs. The conflict still works in the background. Everybody's looking out for their own interests, but realize that their own interests are best protected by understanding other people's interests and finding solutions that kind of meet the needs of both.
Well, John, I did find it to be a fascinating little anecdotal story, because it reflected, as I was reading it, it reflected current events. The current effort to come up with a drought contingency plan essentially goes against apparent self-interest of the players. Now, about Sid and Jennifer and their issue, you wrote, the group was recommending something different, conserving water in order to simply leave it in the river or the basin's reservoirs in trust for all. That sounds very much like what the players are attempting to accomplish now with the DCP.
The drought contingency plan is the most interesting thing. I'm almost wish that I'd waited a year to write the book so I could write about this part too. It's a very interesting, very difficult exercise in doing that, trying to figure out, Arizonans trying to figure out how to allocate shortage, how to use less water within Arizona to leave water in Lake Mead and structure the deal in such a way that it stays in Lake Mead. California finally coming to the table and being willing to give up some water too, to leave that water in Lake Mead. It's critical that the drought contingency proposal, the drought contingency plan, whatever we're calling it right now, succeed, because the alternative is if we keep taking as much water out of Lake Mead as we are now, the system could crash in a really drastic way that could really harm Southern California and Arizona. But if modest near-term steps are taken now to reduce water use in Arizona and California and Nevada is really on board with this too, figuring out how to leave water in Lake Mead, reduce the take on Lake Mead, reduce the water use around the basin. You can see in the modeling results and in the numbers a way you could stabilize Lake Mead at safe levels that avoid some really strong negative sort of near-term risk. But it's about people figuring out, it's about two things. First of all, it's about people realizing, and this is a really important point of the book, that we all can use less water, and that having less water is not the doom to my community. And that's one of the things I tried to show over and over again in the book, is examples of communities that succeeded, survived, and even thrived, even though they had a lot less water than they said 5 years ago or 10 years ago. They really need all that water. They don't have that water, they do okay. When people have less water, they use less water. And that creates the space then for the kind of collaborative negotiations. Well, I'm going to give up some of mine because I realize I can do without it if I have to, for the betterment of the system, and you're going to give up some of yours for the same reason, and then together we can ink a deal that keeps Lake Mead from crashing.
Well, to plug ourselves, the Department of Water Resources in Arizona certainly is working toward that goal, but it wasn't always that way. Now, you wrote at the start of Chapter 5, in the struggle to share the Colorado River, Arizona has always been its worst enemy.
Yeah.
Kindly explain.
So, I'm hard on Arizona, and I think that Arizona has had this long history, and this goes back a century, this sort of chip on its shoulder in its relationship with California. And you actually see the chip on the shoulder in a lot of different ways. I mean, I don't want to overanalyze the psychodrama of Arizona, but there was this belief that the Colorado River was Arizona's entitlement and that California was stealing it. And right or wrong, and historians will debate this, the bottom line was that by being combative, by famously sending out the National Guard in the 1930s to try to prevent the construction of Park Dam, by repeatedly going to the Supreme Court, that Arizona essentially boxed itself out of the collaborative framework for sharing the Colorado River and for the necessary federal subsidies to distribute its water for a long time. And so the result is that, with the doctrine of prior appropriation and the politics around that, you ended up with junior rights on the river because you were so combative. And there's no way to replay the tape of history and, imagine what might have happened if Arizona had joined the fold, ratified the compact in the 1920s, gotten the Central Arizona Project as part of the overall package of early dam and canal building. But the lingering political reality has been that there is this lingering resentment in the political community among Arizonans toward Californians. And that still manifests itself at times today as a combative attitude toward California. That's not going to work, because California holds a very politically powerful and legally powerful position in this negotiation. And so trying to fight against California is wrong in terms of my larger theme of collaboration, but it also probably won't work for y'all. And so there's this tension always within Arizona with resentment to California. They're just wasting water over there, versus the need to make a deal with California.
Well, I can assure you that even in Arizona now, we've gotten to the point where we can laugh about the Arizona Navy crossing over to do combat with the armies of California. Yeah. Those are colorful days.
Yeah, and I think Arizona is doing a lot better. And I think one of the problems is labeling Arizona with one set of attitudes. Arizona was very active in the development of the 2007 shortage sharing agreements and Minute 319, the deal with Mexico that put water in the Delta. And so Arizona has been very much a team player, a collaborative player in all those processes. But there is this lingering political sentiment and a risk because, politicians in Arizona can be successful. They're incentivized to wag a finger at California, and that sort of rallies political support for politicians. So there's some dangerous incentives there, and if y'all pursue those, if the political leadership pursues that combative nature, I think you're in trouble.
Well, point well taken. I personally think that we're a little bit more collaborative than that, but you make a great case. Listen, I want to ask, what, in your view, will it take ultimately to save Lake Mead? I think that follows from the discussion we've just had about collaborative efforts. Is this battle forming up as the modern Southwest's biggest water challenge?
It is, but it's part of a continuum. I mean, what it takes to save Lake Mead, it's actually really simple. We got to use less water. Arizona has sort of pioneered the solidification of the notion of the structural deficit, right? On paper, the entitlements for Nevada, California, Arizona, and Mexico add up to more water than flows in most normal years. So absent a change, Lake Mead keeps dropping. And so ultimately what it takes to save Lake Mead is everybody in the lower basin has to use less water. And how we do that is a complicated negotiated agreement, right? Because if one person just saves water and leaves it in Lake Mead and someone else takes it, it doesn't help. If everybody keeps trying to take their full amount, I fully expect that in the long run you will see a solution that California takes and has to take bigger cuts than it's now contemplated to take under the Drought Contingency Plan. But I'm, not popular when I make that argument over in California. We've already done enough argument. But the bottom line is, you have to take less water out of Lake Mead, and the details of how you do that are a matter of negotiation. I can't sort of a priori come up with them myself. They have to emerge from this negotiated process among the three states and Mexico and the federal government. But the bottom line is, we got to use a lot less water. The important point that I try to make in my book is, we know how to do that. There's this fear that less water in the arid Southwest is a catastrophe for some community. That means somebody has to abandon their city or their farms. And what I argue is, we've seen the kind of success necessary to demonstrate that if we do it mindfully, everybody can save their communities can survive and thrive with the less water that is inevitably going to be available to them.
John, one last question. I've got your book deals a lot with the subjects we just discussed, the issues among the states. But what about the effort to sell a willingness to give up water within the states themselves? Which effort is more complex in your view? Is it the one among the states, or is it the ones within the state?
So this is such a great question, and I have this sort of mental model of how this kind of agreement works. You have a bunch of people working at the basin scale, representatives of the states and the major water agencies, who understand what needs to happen, understand the math, understand how much less water needs to be used. The problem is those people, folks like, your boss, Tom Bishotsky, then have to go back to a local audience, a local political set of constituencies, cities and water agencies and farmers, and explain to them that they need that they are going to have to use less water. And it's that interface between the basin scale and the local scale that is the most difficult, because you have people in these smaller agencies who don't work at the basin scale, who don't necessarily understand it as a basin scale problem, and just understand that the paper allocation of water that their irrigation district gets under the law of the river feels like their entitlement and their right. And if they're giving up less, it's like, why am I giving up less for Las Vegas? Why am I giving up less for Los Angeles? Why am I giving up less for Phoenix? And it's that interface, the communication across that interface, that is the hardest problem. And you see this in the Upper Basin too, and in Colorado and in Utah's discussion now about trying to build a big pipeline, the Lake Powell pipeline. There's really not water there for the Lake Powell pipeline, but the folks in Utah believe that that's their entitlement because it's there on paper. And it's that boundary, communicating across that boundary from the basin scale to local water management, that is the biggest and most important challenge, and that's the hardest place to work. I mean, that's where you all are working right now with the drought contingency proposal discussions.
It is indeed. John, listen, it's been great talking with you. I appreciate you taking the time right now. John's book is Water is for Fighting Over and Other Myths About Water in the West. Good luck with it, John.
Thank you much.
All right, thanks.